It's time for us to check back in with Watermelon Hill and see what happens next. If you've missed any of the previous readings, just look in the description below for a playlist. And if you'd like to purchase the book, please visit watermelonhillbook.com, and I'll also put that link in the description below. George Riggs has got to be the most memorable person I knew during my years on Watermelon Hill, and he was quite a character. He had land adjoining our farm on the north and extending along our line to the river. Everything about George was fascinating to a young boy, and even when I became a young adult, he continued to intrigue me. Old George was about 5 foot 11 inches tall, slender with a slight stoop. His face was somewhat gaunt with a hook to his nose. It was hard to imagine what he might have looked like as a young man, but I think he probably carried himself erect and was not unattractive to the girls. However, George never married and lived alone in an old log cabin over the next hill from our farm. By the time I first remember seeing the cabin, it was starting to fall into disrepair and the land around it was starting to grow up. As the cabin continued on its downhill slide, first the back room fell in, and finally nothing was left. The cabin only had 2 rooms connected by a breezeway and a front porch. Many old houses were built like this, with the kitchen separate from the living area, so that in case of fire in the kitchen, there was at least a possibility of saving the living area. George was a bachelor and lived alone most of the time, but occasionally his sister, a spinster, would live with him for extended periods of time. Kentucky is one of the foremost whiskey-producing states, but for all of my life and until this day, Louisa and all of Lawrence County, Kentucky has been dry as a bone. No liquor. I don't mean just hard liquor either. You can't even buy beer or wine, but just across the river is Fort Gay, West Virginia. You can see one town from the other. As soon as you get across the bridge, all up and down the street is a selection of beer joints and liquor stores, which I am sure have been patronized by many of Louisa's citizens, though most would not admit to it. Some who would have liked to have patronized the establishments would not, for fear of being seen there by someone they knew and having their reputations sullied. George's sister occasionally capitalized on this potential market by buying booze legally in Fort Gay and selling it illegally in Louisa. So the story goes, she would walk across the bridge with a couple of jugs painted white, fill them with liquor, and simply walk back across the bridge. She didn't even try to hide them, just walked across with the jugs in the open. They were white, so no one even questioned that they were anything but milk. When I said that George lived alone, I meant as far as humans were concerned. He did have his dogs, lots of them. They were just mutts, but George loved them. He didn't have much money, just Social Security as far as I knew, but he did his best to feed all his dogs. Nearly every day, if he was not too sick to get out of the house, he walked to the highway and hitchhiked about 3 miles to town. Sometimes he got a ride at least part of the way, sometimes he walked it. Dad always picked him up if Mom wasn't along. George was usually in need of a bath, so Mom didn't really like to ride with him. After I had a car of my own, I picked him up too. He always said the same thing every time. I knowed that was a friend of mine or he wouldn't have stopped. I always stopped, but once I almost wished I hadn't. It was a bitter cold day in winter with a little snow spitting, and George wasn't dressed nearly warm enough, so he was mighty grateful for the ride. After the usual greeting, it didn't take me long to notice that George had a bad cold. How can I put this delicately? He was in urgent need of evacuating his nasal cavities. I don't know if he didn't have a handkerchief or what, but he had a glob hanging down from each nostril about 1 inch or 2 long. I say 1 inch or 2 because every once in a while he would snuff it back up, then it would gradually ooze back down. I nearly lost my breakfast. It was one of those things where I could hardly stand to look at him, but I was too fascinated not to take a peek once in a while. I had the strongest urge to take a pair of scissors and snip it off. The reason George went to town so much was to keep his dogs fed. He would go to the restaurants and hotels to collect scraps for his dogs, then hitchhike back home with a big bag full of scraps. Someone once asked him how many dogs he had, and he answered, "Oh, I guess about 20 or 25 dogs and a couple of bushels of pups." He probably really didn't know exactly how many he had. Part of George's land came down to the river and extended north along the riverfront. On the slope down to the river, there was another cabin similar to the one George lived in, but maybe a little smaller. It had started to fall down by the first time I saw it, and it was never used in my recollections. But one of my older brothers said it was sometimes used as a meeting place for young lovers. I suspect he may have had first-hand knowledge. George's land, like ours, was on a hill which had high rock cliffs overlooking the river. On top of the rocks, George had built an old bench of saplings nailed together. In good weather, especially a nice day in spring, he would walk to his bench and sit in the sun to look out over the river. From our back porch, we could see George coming over the crest of the hill to the north, walking down to his bench, followed by a string of dogs stretching all the way to the top of the hill. I've counted over 20, and that was just the ones that were at home at the time. There were probably several at any given time out roaming around. George's dogs were often accused of killing neighbors' chickens and even a goat or sheep from time to time. It was probably true, as they undoubtedly did not get enough to eat, and sometimes they traveled in a pack of at least 3 or 4, hardly ever alone. As a result, the pack was periodically thinned by some neighbors who shot them to protect their animals. I never did, even though they got one of our chickens a few times, but I think my dad did take out a few of them. I hunted when I was growing up, but I could not have killed a dog unless it was trying to kill me. As a teenager, I loved to hunt and went every time I had a chance, either with someone or by myself. Don't get the wrong idea, this was not called sport hunting. If we hunted and killed a game animal, we ate it. In fact, it was a very welcome addition to our usual diet of salt-cured pork and vegetables. We had plenty of land with lots of brush around the fields and in the areas unsuitable for farming as cover for rabbits and quail, so I usually hunted on our farm. Sometimes, though, I hunted for squirrels, and as the best area for squirrels was in the big beech trees on the northern border of our farm, sometimes I would cross over to George's land. If I was near his cabin, I usually tried to stop and talk with him for a while. He was always delighted that someone had taken the time to stop and visit with him. Some people thought George was a little off, but I don't think so. I think he was just different and wanted to live by his own rules. He would tell me tales of where he had been as a young man and of his adventures. Some of them were probably true, but I took his tales with a liberal helping of salt. According to George and other people in the area, he was in the Spanish-American War. I think that one was true because he had a lot of details and it was substantiated. I have wished that I had a tape recorder back then, but of course I did not. George was fascinating, but I guess I may have gone to see George's cabin as much as to see George himself. You could not drive to the cabin, although there were the remains of an old road leading in from the neighbor's farm. I think the only vehicle that ever went in there was a heavy truck that hauled a load of coal every fall. It must have just bulled its way through the underbrush. At one time, though, someone must have taken pride in the road and the whole place. The old road was lined with plants that had been set out for landscaping. They were what we used to call Spanish needles and sewing thread, a cactus-type plant with big stickers on them. According to the old-timers in the area, the place was quite beautiful in earlier years and had been named Magnolia Manor by a local Boy Scout troop. The cabin was at least as unusual as George. It was sort of like something out of another century, combined with an episode of The Twilight Zone. It was built of logs, and of course it had no electricity or running water. By the time I was a teenager, the kitchen roof had started to cave in, and George was living in the front room only. It had a huge stone fireplace for such a small room. The ceiling was very low. I remember when I was 16 or 17, I had to duck to keep from hitting my head on the rafters, and there were other hazards everywhere you looked. Hanging from the ceiling, all over the walls, even on the front porch, were a collection of old knives and guns of all descriptions, along with travel posters, heads carved from coconuts, etc. An eccentric and fascinating collection of a life of roaming and pack riding. I would have loved to have had one of his old guns. A lot of them were muzzle loaders, and even in their rusted condition would have been worth quite a bit. Actually, if I had asked George for one, he might have given it to me, or at least sold it cheap. He liked me. Of course, I would never have done such a thing. I wasn't brought up that way. I just admired them and drooled a little. Although George seemed to be almost a hermit, he enjoyed socializing when he went to town gathering dog food. You could usually find him on the corner in Louisa where the one and only traffic light was, in front of the Brunswick Hotel and corner drugstore, diagonally across from Don's Hardware, or in the courthouse yard on the other side of the street. He would talk to anyone who would take the time to talk to him. The courthouse yard was the favorite gathering place for all the old men who had come to town to shop or get a haircut. Their favorite activities were swapping lies and pocket knives with each other. Swapping pocket knives was an old country tradition, and they never wanted to trade even. You could always count on one of the parties saying, "How much boot you give me?" Boot meaning how much money in addition to your knife. Whenever George went to town, especially if it was a Saturday, he duded up in what I guess he thought were classy looking clothes, but they were the strangest combinations you could imagine. He might have on an old plaid sport jacket, brown and white wingtips, a wrinkled dress shirt, and a polka-dotted tie. All his clothes were very old and worn, but he wanted to look his best to go to town. All the neighbors said that whenever there was a death in the neighborhood, George was sure to show up. I'm sure he wanted to offer his sympathy, but also wanted the chance to socialize a little. It was the custom for family and neighbors to sit up with the corpse at night until the funeral, and there were always sandwiches and various foods served to the guests. Neighbors always brought in food if there was a death in the family. George did not usually have an abundance of food at home, so this was a chance to get some good cooking for free. One time when George was sick, my brother Jack and a friend of his helped him with some chores he was not able to do. Jack has always told about cleaning out the fireplace. As I said before, it was a very big fireplace, and the ashes had been accumulating for a long time. George had a pile of coal in the room and kept feeding the fire, but finally there was hardly any space left to build a fire for all the ashes. Jack estimates, conservatively, that they hauled 10 wash tubs full of ashes out of that fireplace. Then they hauled more coal into the house so George could get to it conveniently. He had his bed close to the fireplace so he could feed the fire easily. Unfortunately, George's tale does not have a happy ending. He was an old man, and as far as anyone knew, had only one living relative by that time, a niece who lived in western Kentucky. He was never married, so he had no children to look after him. When some of the neighbors realized they hadn't seen George out in 2 or 3 weeks, they went to check on him. They found George lying near the fireplace, unable to walk, with no fire, no food, nearly frozen and starved. George said he had 1 egg left and had tried to crack it, but it was frozen and he couldn't eat it. His niece was contacted and George was put in the hospital. While he was gone from his cabin, vandals broke in and stole all of his collection of antique guns. I never heard who did it, but I hope someday they get what they deserve for taking away an old man's memories. George did come back for a while, but soon passed away. I still went by his cabin a couple of more times after that. I was married and had a family by that time, but when I was visiting my folks, I loved to get out and roam the hills. Once, years after George was gone, I went by his cabin, or what remained of it. By that time, most of the remaining room of the cabin had started to fall down and return to nature. No one would ever live in it again, and I don't know what has become of the land. On my last visit there, I started poking around some old trash piles. With no way to haul trash off, it just got thrown in a pile a short distance away from the house. I found 3 trash piles, each one older than the last. I could tell from the bottles I found. Some had dates on them, some were just old-style bottles, all with corks, no screw tops. I collected a burlap sack of antique bottles from the trash piles, old medicine bottles, whiskey bottles, canning jars, all colors, sizes, and shapes. Those were my only souvenirs from George. I also collected an extreme case of poison ivy. It was winter and there were no leaves showing, otherwise I could have spotted the poison ivy as far as I could have seen it. In digging through the trash pile, I didn't realize I was also digging through poison ivy roots. There were a few other colorful characters that lived near Watermelon Hill, but George was the most memorable. I'm sure he would never have dreamed that anyone would ever write about him or even remember him. Mrs. Fugate. Another memorable character near Watermelon Hill was Mrs. Fugate. She lived about 2 miles away, back in the hills to the south of our farm. She was the very picture of a witch. She was short, thin, bent over, and very, very old. I didn't know how old she was when I was a teenager, and no one else seemed to know. It wouldn't have surprised me if she didn't know either. I was curious about her and asked some of the adults around the neighborhood how old she was. The people I was asking were maybe 50 or 60 years old, and they all said they had no idea. But she had been an old woman when they were children. I'm sure she could not have weighed more than 90 pounds, but had amazing strength and endurance. She seemed to be made of hickory and rawhide. No doubt she had led a very hard life, and it had toughened her out of necessity to survive. Our farm was known for its great watermelons, so one summer Mrs. Fugate came to our house to buy some. She had a very large burlap sack and picked out 5 big melons. That would have been an extremely heavy load for a strong man to carry for a short distance, but she intended to carry them the entire 2 miles home. What makes this even more amazing is that she pulled the sack onto her shoulder and proceeded to have a conversation with my parents. If I had been going to stand there for more than 10 seconds, I would have set that heavy load down, but not her. I was so amazed by her feat of strength that I timed her. She stood there talking with the sack of 5 watermelons on her shoulder for 30 minutes, then started off on her long walk home. Dumbfounded, I watched her until she went out of sight. I could see her for about a quarter of a mile across the fields, and she had not stopped or slowed down by that time. I know I wouldn't believe it either if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, but it's true, I swear. I don't know how long Mrs. Fugate lived after I grew up and left home, or how old she was, but I wouldn't be too shocked if she was still alive. While I was a senior in high school, 1959-60, a little girl came to live with Mrs. Fugate. I never knew her name, but I think she was in the 7th grade at the time. No one really knew much about Mrs. Fugate's past, or even if she had any family. But I assumed that the little girl was her grandchild or great-grandchild. Whatever her relationship, if any, that is where she was living. The child was almost always very dirty, and her clothes were in no better shape. As a result, the other kids made fun of her. Kids can be very cruel. I'm sure her condition was not her fault. She had more than likely been raised that way all of her life and had no proper supervision, if any at all. She was almost what you would picture a little wild girl to be like. She had grown up tough and seemed to expect abuse from everyone, and usually got it. So she gave it back. She had a real chip on her shoulder, but hardly anyone even tried to give her a chance to be nice, so I couldn't blame her completely. I always felt sorry for the girl, but one day something happened that really touched me. We were riding the school bus home in the evening like usual, and I heard the girl smarting off at some kid who was teasing her like usual. But when I looked over at her, I noticed that she was clutching a pair of dirty ballerina shoes to her scrawny chest. I don't know where she got them, if someone gave them to her, she stole them, or what, but they were obviously not new. What struck a chord of sympathy with me was that even in her condition of squalor, she must have had dreams of being something better. I don't know what she intended to do with the shoes, as I'm sure no one ever sent her to ballet classes. She probably just pretended by herself at home to escape her situation, at least for a little while, if only in her imagination. I hope she did have the chance to better herself as she grew up, but the chances of that were slim. If she did, maybe the rough edges were smoothed off a bit. I hope so, because she was well on the way to becoming as tough as old Mrs. Fugate herself. Jim Hardwick. Jim Hardwick was another neighbor who was very memorable. He was not a character like Mrs. Fugate and George Riggs, but memorable just the same. The last time I stopped and talked with Jim, he was something over 80 and was still going fox and coon hunting with the younger men and boys, thrashing through briar thickets and creeks, up and down hills in the middle of the night, keeping a pace that many young men would find difficult. I went to school with his 3 grandsons, Larry, Don, and Jimmy. All of the boys have great respect for their grandfather and have expressed to me their wish that they could learn even half of what old Jim knew. At first I thought they were being sarcastic and were just making fun of the old man, but as I came to know more about him, I realized they were completely serious. Jim was a remarkable man who seemed to have a photographic memory, recalling names, dates, places, and times of things that happened 60 or 70 years before. Jim was at least 50 years older than me the last time I talked to him, but he would have left me in the dust in the memory department even then. Like my family, Jim farmed with a team of horses. He was just a poor farmer without a tractor, but in his younger years, he was something of an adventurer. He told me stories about construction jobs he had worked on, building some of the first roads through the mountains of Kentucky and Tennessee. The details of those jobs that he remembered were nothing short of amazing. It seemed like no time at all had passed instead of 60 years. He could recall conversations, co-workers, and bosses' names, details of problems on the job, etc. He became a demolitions expert and did the blasting on many roads that opened up new country to development. I've heard older people in the neighborhood say that Jim could pick up a mountain and set it down wherever you wanted it. Such was his expertise with explosives. Even when Jim was in his 70s, he was called upon to help with explosives in the building of a new road through our area, so I guess his reputation had endured for a long time. We'll stop right there for today. Another interesting peek into Dale's life there on Watermelon Hill. I really enjoyed hearing about all the different characters. You're probably the same as Dale and the same as me. You can immediately think of characters that you've known in your life, maybe that lived near you, maybe you met them at work or at school or something like that. Really nice, though, to hear his memories about the different ones. The first one, George, interesting that he, kind of sad, like a sad ending of what finally happened to him, but interesting that he had so many dogs and that he took care of all the dogs. The house, the way Dale described it, we would call that a dog trot house. So, like he said, there was a room and a room with usually a covered area that was open, kind of like a breezeway, we might say today, but often called a dog trot. So dogs could trot right through there without going in the house. Another interesting part for me that I'm always thinking about the language that jumped out at me in that part when he was talking about George, about his sister, his spinster sister, who come and lived with George and figured out how to game the system and sell her whiskey illegal, her liquor that she'd walked across the bridge and bought. But he called them beer joints. That's what Pap would have said, beer joints. You don't hear that much today. You might hear a bar or the liquor store or the beer, the gas stations today even sell beer and wine and different things like that. But beer joint, that's exactly how Pap would have described those areas, those stores along that street that Dale was describing. The part where Dale was describing when George would go to town, when he'd go to town to gather up all those scraps for his dogs, that he would try to dress up, that reminded me of one of the characters that Pap talked about in this area that lived here in Brasstown. Older gentleman when Pap was a boy, and Pap said he wore overalls, but with his overalls he would wear a tie. said he might have gravy or something on it, but he'd wear a tie with his overalls. And he also wore what Pap called fancy socks. And he wore his pants, he'd fix his breechy legs where you could make sure that people could see those fancy socks. I guess they were maybe, you know, you think about socks with patterns on them, they were something like that. So there's probably, you know, to us it just seems odd or quirky or whatever, but to those, the old man here that Pap knew, or the George that Dale's describing, like Dale said, he certainly thought he was dressing up to go to town, even though in our eyes, or in the people's eyes in those days, they may have been, you know, kind of looking at him with a little smile about how they were dressing. Then I'm glad Dale got to go back and dig around in those trash piles. That's one of mine and Corey and Katie's favorite things to do. And that was common, I'm sure, not just in Appalachia, but in everywhere, you know, all over, but definitely in the mountains of Appalachia. When there was no readily place for you to take your trash, there was no dumpsters, there was no landfills or anything like that. People didn't, I don't think that they accumulated trash like we do today, because they had less material things and were purchasing less from stores like we do. And even what they purchased didn't come in all the wrappings and the plastic and the stuff today that we get. Anyway, but it was common to find a place on your land, and that was your dump, and that's where you put the stuff that you just couldn't use, you know, that you wasn't just going to use. A lot of it they tried to reuse, but if there was something you wasn't going to reuse, that's where it went, that was your dump on your land. Over the years, Corey and I and Katie and I have been able to dig at lots of dumps like that. Most of the time the glass, the things, whether it's a canning jar, an old medicine bottle, whatever, old liquor bottle, are broken, but sometimes you find one that's not, and it's such a treasure, such a treasure. We have friends that have let us kind of go to their land and dig on their places, and then also in my general area here, because my family's been here for so long, there's several dumps that we've dug in over the years that my family left. Those were always especially meaningful to me. I have some snuff glasses that one dump just up the creek there, I found 6 snuff glasses with the lid still on them, just sitting side by side. And I'm sure whoever, maybe my big grandma's what I always like to think, but whoever set them down there, probably they were in a box or a bag, and then that you know, deteriorated over the years, leaving just those glass jars sitting there. Of course, the sad part of Dale's getting those bottles, it was wonderful he got them, but that he got poison, he says poison ivy. We call everything poison oak. I just say poison oak, whatever I don't know I know there's a difference, I'm sure, but it's all poison oak to us. But that he got poison oak, so that was bad that he got it. Interesting that he got it in the winter. A lot of people think that you can't get it in the winter. I have a first-hand experience with that, so I know, not me, I never was one to get poison oak bad. Actually, I've had it one time in my life that I remember, and it was horrible. I was a grown adult, and I was working, not in the winter, about this time of the year, helping someone clean out their flower beds, and maybe it was on up in May, because things were, you know, like I was pulling weeds and stuff, but I was also pulling poison oak and didn't know it, and I was carrying it in my arms like to where I was throwing it, so I got it really bad on both my arms. I probably wouldn't have got it if I'd come home and took a bath, you know, or took a shower and washed off, but I went from that job to another job, so it was like hours later that night, before I ever took a bath. Anyway, I ended up having to go to the doctor. It's horrible, but that's the only time I've had it. But when Paul and I were little, we had gravity water, Granny and Pap did, which until I was in about 8th grade, which meant in the winter, if it froze, Pap had to thaw it out. Well, there was one winter, it was in the 70s, that was just really, really bitter cold, late 70s, and it stayed froze a lot, and Pap would have to go along. Lots of places it was buried, but there was some places you couldn't bury it because it was just solid rock unless you was going to dynamite, like the last character that Dale was describing. But anyway, we'd go along and Pap would build fires along the way to thaw it up. And me and Paul thought that was great. We played in the fires. Well, we somehow burned poison oak, kind of like Dale, not seeing the leaves. You know, you just can't tell what it is in the wintertime. And Paul got a really, really bad case of poison oak, and he ended up having to go to the doctor. And the first doctor Pap took him to said, no, it can't be poison oak. It's in the winter. And Pap, when she left, the nurse said, well, she's crazy, it's poison oak. I agree with you, it's poison oak. And So then Pap ended up taking him to another doctor, and he said, yes, it's poison oak. You can get poison oak if you handle it, or, you know, Pap explained we'd been burning stuff. So anyway, he got medicine and got better. But so Dale paid for his getting those wonderful bottles that were George's, all those memories that I'm so glad he got them. And he probably would say, too, that it was worth the case of poison ivy that he got. So the last person that I shared the memories of, Jim, he said he had a photographic memory, and he could remember all those, even the conversations and stuff. I wish I had a memory like that. I don't. But you know who I think does? Is Mrs. Hicks, Granny Hicks. If you've watched any of my videos with her, she can remember such details about when she was a child, and remember every teacher's name, and the mother, you know, a family that lived near her, the mother, the father, the kids. She can remember it all. My memory's not that good. I wish it was, but it's just not. So I hope you enjoyed this part of the book. Hope you'll leave me a comment and tell me what jumped out at you or what pricked your memory. And as always, I hope you'll drop back by next Friday. We've got to see what happens next in Watermelon Hill.